I never thought I'd find myself staring at an empty dining room, paint rollers in hand, wondering if a fresh coat of color could change the way this house made me feel. The once vibrant space, filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses during family dinners, now sat hollow. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a presence, heavy and unrelenting. The idea to repaint had come to me on a whim, part of my attempt to reclaim the house from the memories that seemed to cling to every corner. Paul, my late husband, had loved this room. It was where we celebrated birthdays, toasted anniversaries, and gathered with family. Now, 5 years after his passing, it felt like a mausoleum, a shrine to a life I couldn't seem to move past. That's when Ethan stepped in, as he often did. "Repainting the dining room?" he'd asked a week ago, his smile teasing but kind. "You planning to tackle that alone?" Ethan had a way of making me feel seen, even when I didn't want to be. At 28, he carried himself with a confidence that was equal parts natural and practiced. He was Paul's son from his first marriage, but over the years, he had become a steady presence in my life. After Paul's death, Ethan had been my rock, helping with house repairs, checking in with phone calls, making sure I wasn't drowning in my own solitude. "I can handle it," I'd replied, though the truth was, I wasn't sure I could. He'd raised an eyebrow, his grin widening. "I'll come by Saturday," he said, as though the matter was settled. Saturday arrived with the promise of clear skies and warm sunlight. Ethan showed up just as I was dragging the paint cans into the dining room, his casual confidence already filling the house. "Didn't I tell you to wait for me?" he teased, leaning against the doorway. I glanced up, my heart giving a strange little flutter at the sight of him. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his jeans faded, but there was something about the way he carried himself that always caught me off guard. "I thought I'd get a head start," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Uh-huh," he replied, stepping into the room and grabbing one of the paint cans. "You'd have spilled this all over the floor by now." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help the smile tugging at my lips. "You're insufferable, you know that?" "So I've been told," he said with a grin, setting the can down and grabbing a roller. We worked in companionable silence for the first hour, the rhythm of the paint rollers filling the room. I focused on the task at hand, determined to ignore the way Ethan's presence seemed to shift the air around me. But it was impossible not to notice him. The way his shirt clung to his back as he stretched to reach the higher corners of the wall. The way his laughter filled the space when he caught me struggling to open a stubborn can of paint. "You're going to hurt yourself," he said, gently taking the can from my hands. "I'm not that helpless," I replied, though my breath hitched slightly when his fingers brushed mine. "I never said you were," he said, his voice softer now. It was a small moment, insignificant to anyone else, but it lingered. For the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me, a warmth, a pull, something I couldn't quite name. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation flowed more easily. We joked about my questionable choice of paint color. "Sunflower yellow? Really?" he'd said, laughing, and shared memories of Paul. Ethan told me stories I hadn't heard before, moments from his childhood that painted a fuller picture of the man I'd loved. "Dad used to bring me in here after school," Ethan said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "He'd make me sit at that table and do my homework while he cooked dinner. He always said this room was the heart of the house." I nodded, my throat tightening. "He loved this place," I said softly. "And so do you," Ethan replied, his eyes meeting mine. There was something in the way he looked at me then, steady, unflinching, as though he was seeing not just the woman I was now, but the one I'd been before life had worn me down. The moment passed quickly, but it left a mark. By the time we finished for the day, the room was half painted, the sunlight casting golden streaks across the floor. Ethan stood in the middle of the room, surveying our work with a satisfied smile. "Not bad for a day's work," he said, turning to me. "Not bad at all," I agreed, though my focus wasn't on the walls. As he packed up the paint supplies, I caught myself watching him, my chest tightening with a mix of emotions I wasn't ready to name. For years, this house had felt like a tomb, a place filled with memories but devoid of life. But now, with Ethan here, it felt different. Warmer, lighter. And as I stood in the doorway, the faint scent of paint in the air, I couldn't help but wonder if this project wasn't just about the dining room, Maybe it was about me, too. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, my mind already on the task at hand. The half-painted dining room waited, the scent of fresh paint still lingering in the air. It had been years since I'd thrown myself into something like this, and a part of me relished the distraction. Ethan arrived not long after breakfast, a tray of coffees in hand, and a grin that was just a little too smug. "Figured you might need some fuel," he said, setting the cups on the counter. "I could have managed," I replied, though the sight of him leaning casually against the kitchen island made my pulse quicken in a way I didn't want to admit. "You're welcome," he teased, grabbing one of the cups and handing it to me. "Thanks," I muttered, taking a sip to avoid looking at him directly. Back in the dining room, we fell into an easy rhythm. The sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the space as we worked side by side. Ethan tackled the higher sections of the wall, standing confidently on the ladder, while I focused on the trim near the floor. "Careful down there," he said with a chuckle when I bumped into the bucket of paint with my knee. "Careful up there," I shot back, glancing up just as he stretched to reach a corner. The ladder wobbled slightly, and my heart lurched. "Ethan," I said, dropping my brush as I rushed toward him. "I'm fine," he assured me, stepping down with a grin. "You worry too much." "Someone has to," I muttered, picking up my brush again. But as the day wore on, I couldn't deny the way my focus kept drifting to him. The way his shirt clung to his back as he worked, the way his laughter seemed to fill the room, making it feel alive again. At one point, he turned suddenly, catching me mid-glance. "What?" he asked, his brow quirking in amusement. "Nothing," I said quickly, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. He didn't press, but the knowing smile he gave me lingered, making it harder to concentrate. We broke for lunch, sitting on the floor with sandwiches and cold drinks. The conversation turned light and easy, a welcome reprieve from the unspoken tension that seemed to build every time we were too close. "So," he said, gesturing to the walls around us. "Why sunflower yellow?" I laughed, shaking my head. "I don't know. It felt cheerful, I guess." He smiled, his expression softening. "It suits you," he said. The comment caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "I'm not sure anyone's ever called me cheerful," I said finally, my voice quieter now. "They should," he replied, his gaze steady. After lunch, we returned to the task at hand. The hours seemed to slip by as the room slowly transformed, the dull, faded walls replaced by vibrant color. At one point, as I crouched to reach a tricky corner, I felt him behind me, his presence warm and solid. "Here," he said, reaching down to steady the trim as I painted. His hand brushed against mine briefly, and the contact sent a jolt through me. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice unsteady. "Anytime," he said, his tone lighter, but I caught the flicker of something deeper in his eyes. By late afternoon, we'd nearly finished, the room glowing with new life. Ethan leaned against the ladder, surveying our work with a satisfied grin. "Not bad," he said, turning to me. "You might actually have a knack for this." "Don't push it," I said, though I couldn't help but smile. As he stepped down, he stumbled slightly, his foot catching on the last rung. Instinctively, I reached out, my hands finding his arm to steady him. "You okay?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter now. We were close, too close. I could feel the warmth of his skin through his shirt, the steady rhythm of his breathing. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. I pulled back quickly, my hands falling to my sides as I stepped away. "Careful," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Always," he replied, though his tone was laced with something I couldn't quite place. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur, the weight of that moment lingering between us. Every glance, every accidental touch felt amplified, leaving me more unsettled than I cared to admit. That evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, I replayed the day in my mind. Ethan's laughter, the way his eyes lingered on mine, the warmth of his hand brushing against mine. It all felt too much, too soon. But as the stars began to appear in the sky, I couldn't deny the way he made me feel. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel quite so empty. And for the first time in years, neither did I. The next morning, the dining room was awash in sunlight, the newly painted yellow walls glowing warmly. I lingered by the doorway, coffee mug in hand, admiring the work Ethan and I had done. The space looked brighter, almost like it belonged to a different house, a different version of me. Not bad, Ethan said, startling me as he walked in with his usual easy confidence. He was holding a small tray of bagels and fruit, a gesture that felt too thoughtful and yet so typical of him. You keep bringing food over, I'm going to start expecting it, I teased, trying to keep my tone light. Well, can't have you passing out mid-project, he replied, setting the tray down on the dining room table. There was a lightness to our exchange, but beneath it, something else simmered, a quiet awareness of how close we'd come the day before. As we ate breakfast, the conversation turned to the list of remaining house projects. The casual topic was a welcome distraction, though every now and then our eyes would meet, and I'd feel that familiar flutter in my chest. Afterward, Ethan suggested tackling the bookshelf in the study, which had been leaning precariously to one side for months. Don't you think we should take a break? I asked, half joking. Fixing this house is my break, he said with a grin. Come on, you'll thank me when it doesn't collapse under the weight of all those books. In the study, we worked in tandem, the silence between us comfortable but filled with an undercurrent of tension. I handed him tools as he adjusted the shelves, watching as he worked with the same quiet determination he brought to everything. Dad used to hate this room, Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up, surprised. Really? Why? He shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. He always said it was too cluttered, but I think he just didn't like sitting still long enough to read. I laughed softly, the sound easing the weight in my chest. That sounds like him. Ethan glanced at me then, his expression softening. You miss him a lot, don't you? The question was simple, but it struck a chord. I nodded, my throat tightening. Every day, I admitted. We fell silent for a moment, the air between us heavy with shared grief. Then Ethan set down the screwdriver and turned to face me fully. You know, he used to talk about you all the time, he said. How much he admired you, how lucky he felt to have you. I blinked, caught off guard by the emotion in his voice. He did? Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. He loved you, Meredith, more than anything. The sincerity in his words brought tears to my eyes, and I looked away, my hands trembling slightly. Thank you for telling me that, I whispered. You deserved to hear it, he said softly. We worked in relative silence after that, but the moment lingered, a quiet connection forming in the shared vulnerability. When we finally finished, Ethan stood back, surveying the now sturdy bookshelf with a satisfied smile. Perfect, he said, brushing his hands on his jeans. Thanks for the help, I said, though my voice carried more weight than I intended. Always, he replied, his eyes lingering on mine for just a second too long. That evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and pink, we decided to sit on the back porch with glasses of wine. The air was cool, the sound of crickets filling the silence between us. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You ever think about what comes next? He asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? For you, he said, turning to look at me. What's next for you? I hesitated, the weight of the question settling over me. I don't know, I admitted. For a long time, it felt like there wasn't a next, like everything ended when Paul. I trailed off, the words catching in my throat. But now, he pressed gently. I took a deep breath, my gaze drifting to the glass in my hand. Now, I'm starting to think maybe there is, I said quietly. The honesty of the moment made my chest ache, and I could feel Ethan's eyes on me, his presence steady and grounding. You deserve to be happy, Meredith, he said, his voice low but firm. I looked at him then, the sincerity in his expression nearly undoing me. It's been so long since I've even thought about what that means, I admitted. Then maybe it's time to start, he said simply. The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction behind them, sent a shiver through me. As the night wore on, the conversation grew lighter, but the weight of what we'd shared lingered. At one point, Ethan reached for the bottle of wine to pour us another glass, his hand brushing against mine. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, and I felt my breath hitch. I glanced at him, my heart racing as I caught the way his gaze softened, his focus entirely on me. Meredith, he said softly, my name hanging in the air between us. I didn't know what to say, so I looked away, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Ethan leaned back, breaking the tension with a quiet laugh. Sorry, he said, running a hand through his hair. I didn't mean to make things weird. You didn't, I said quickly, though my voice betrayed the conflict churning inside me. He gave me a small smile, his eyes searching mine. I don't want to push you, he said, but I need you to know, I care about you. A lot. His confession left me breathless, and for a moment, I couldn't find the words. Ethan, He shook his head, his smile softening. It's okay, you don't have to say anything, I just needed you to know. The weight of his words settled over me, and as the night wore on, I found myself replaying them in my mind. When I finally went to bed, the house felt different, warmer, fuller, as though something had shifted. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to think about what might come next. The following day felt different, though I couldn't quite explain why. The house was quiet as usual, but there was a strange energy in the air, like something had shifted during the night. I found myself glancing at the clock more often than necessary, waiting for Ethan to arrive, though I told myself it was only because we still had projects to finish. When his car pulled into the driveway, I felt a flutter of something between anticipation and nervousness. Morning, he said as he stepped inside, his usual easy grin in place. He carried a small box of tools and a bag of pastries, setting them down on the kitchen counter. Morning, I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. Ready to tackle the living room today? He asked, pulling a croissant from the bag and offering it to me. Sure, I said, though the thought of spending another day in such close proximity to him made my pulse quicken. We started with the shelves in the living room, reorganizing and reinforcing them where necessary. It was a slow, methodical task, but the quiet moments between us only seemed to amplify the tension that had been building. At one point, as I handed him a stack of books, his fingers brushed against mine. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, my breath catching in my throat. Thanks, he said softly, his gaze lingering on mine for just a moment too long. I quickly turned away, pretending to busy myself with another pile of books, but the heat in my cheeks was impossible to ignore. As the morning wore on, the tension between us became harder to dismiss. Every glance, every accidental touch felt magnified, like we were both acutely aware of the space, or lack thereof, between us. While dusting one of the higher shelves, I stretched to reach the top, balancing precariously on my tiptoes. Careful, Ethan said, stepping closer. I've got it, I replied, though the wobble in my stance said otherwise. Before I could steady myself, he reached out, his hands gently gripping my waist to keep me balanced. There, he said, his voice low. The warmth of his hands, the steadiness of his touch, it was too much. I stepped down quickly, putting distance between us, though my heart was racing. Thanks, I murmured, not meeting his eyes. Anytime, he replied, his tone light, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper. By midday, the living room shelves were complete, and Ethan suggested taking a break. Let's step outside, he said. It's too nice a day to stay cooped up in here. We walked out to the back patio, the sun warm against my skin. Ethan leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You've been quiet today, he said, his tone casual but probing. Just tired, I said quickly, though the truth was far more complicated. He nodded, but the look he gave me told me he didn't quite believe it. As the afternoon wore on, the unspoken tension between us grew harder to ignore. Every glance felt loaded, every brush of his hand against mine, intentional. When we moved back inside to tackle the final section of the living room, the silence was almost deafening. Meredith, Ethan said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Yes? I asked, glancing over my shoulder at him. He hesitated, his gaze steady but uncertain. Have I done something to make you uncomfortable? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. No, I said finally, though my voice wavered. Because if I have... You haven't, I interrupted, turning to face him fully. The air between us felt charged, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Then what is it? He asked, stepping closer. I shook my head, my chest tightening. Ethan, I don't know how to explain it. Try, he said softly. I hesitated, my hands gripping the edge of the table for support. It's just... everything feels different with you, I admitted, my voice trembling. He stepped closer still, his presence grounding and overwhelming all at once. Different how? Like I can't stop thinking about you, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. And it scares me. Ethan's expression softened and he reached for my hand, his touch gentle. You don't have to be scared, he said, his voice steady. You're not alone in this. The confession hung between us, raw and unfiltered. I could feel the warmth of his hand against mine, the quiet certainty in his gaze. Ethan, I trailed off, my throat tight with emotion. It's okay, he said, his thumb brushing lightly against my fingers. You don't have to say anything right now. The tenderness in his voice broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned into him, my forehead resting against his chest. For a moment we just stood there, the silence between us filled with unspoken understanding. When I finally pulled back, Ethan cupped my face gently, his eyes searching mine. Meredith, I care about you, he said, his voice firm but soft. More than I probably should. His words sent a shiver through me, and I felt my breath catch as he leaned in slightly. I didn't stop him. When his lips met mine, it was like the air was pulled from the room. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened, the weight of all our unspoken feelings pouring into that single moment. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. This changes everything, I whispered, my voice shaky. Maybe it does, he replied, his thumb brushing gently against my cheek. But maybe that's not a bad thing. I nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered. We'll figure it out, I said softly. Together, he promised. The days following that kiss felt like a blur. Every interaction with Ethan was tinged with a new intensity, a quiet understanding that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. The house felt fuller when he was in it, every corner brimming with the weight of what we'd shared. Yet, neither of us brought it up. Until that Saturday evening. The sun was setting as we stood in the dining room, now completely painted and furnished. The sunflower yellow walls glowed warmly in the fading light, a reflection of the quiet transformation happening within me. It looks good, Ethan said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. It does, I agreed, though my focus wasn't on the room. He turned to me then, his gaze steady. You're different, he said softly. I blinked, startled by the comment. Different how? Lighter, he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Happier. The sincerity in his words sent a wave of emotion through me, and I looked away, my chest tightening. As the evening wore on, we drifted to the porch, a bottle of wine between us. The breeze carried the faint scent of salt water, and the sound of the waves was a soothing backdrop to the tension crackling between us. Meredith? Ethan said suddenly, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. Yes? He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. We can't keep pretending nothing's changed. My breath hitched, and I set my glass down, my fingers trembling. I know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Then why do you keep pulling away? He asked, his tone gentle but firm. I swallowed hard, the question cutting through my defenses. Because I'm scared, I said honestly. Whatever this is, it's not supposed to happen. Who says? He countered, leaning forward. I opened my mouth to reply, but found myself at a loss. I don't care what anyone thinks, he continued, his voice steady. What I feel for you, it's real, Meredith, and I think you feel it too. The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. I do, I said, my voice trembling, but it doesn't make it any less complicated. Life is complicated, he said softly, reaching for my hand, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for what makes us happy. I stared at him, my heart racing. For so long, I'd let fear dictate my choices, let grief keep me trapped in the past. But Ethan's words, his presence, made me feel like maybe I could have something more. Without thinking, I leaned toward him, my lips finding his in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a release, a quiet surrender to everything we'd been holding back. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I felt the world around us fade away. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. This feels right, he said softly. It does, I admitted, my voice trembling. The moment deepened as he led me inside, the unspoken tension between us giving way to something raw and undeniable. The living room, with its warm light and familiar furniture, felt like the right place for what came next. Ethan's touch was tentative at first, his hands brushing against mine as he guided me to the couch. Are you sure? He asked, his voice low and filled with concern. Yes, I said. the single word carrying more certainty than I'd felt in years. What followed wasn't hurried or careless. It was slow, deliberate, every movement filled with emotion. His hands traced the lines of my face, his touch reverent, as though he were memorizing every detail. When his lips met mine again, it was with a passion that left me breathless. The barriers between us dissolved, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. The moment was more than physical. It was emotional, a connection that ran deeper than I'd thought possible. Afterward, we sat together in the quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the ocean outside. Ethan's arm was wrapped around me, his touch grounding and comforting. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his gaze filled with concern. "I am," I said, resting my head against his chest. "For the first time in a long time, I really am." His hand brushed against my hair, and I felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my cheek. The night felt like a turning point, a moment when everything shifted. But with that shift came a quiet fear, a realization that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. Ethan was quiet for a moment before replying. "We take it one day at a time," he said. "We figure it out together." I nodded, his words bringing a small measure of comfort. As the hours passed, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. The house that had once felt so empty now felt full of possibility. And Ethan, with his quiet strength and unwavering presence, had become the light in a darkness I hadn't even realized I was living in. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, I felt a quiet sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, I could embrace this new chapter of my life. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. I woke up on the couch, Ethan's arms still draped around me, his breathing steady and peaceful. For a moment, I simply watched him, letting the quiet calm of the morning settle over me. I hadn't felt this at ease in years. The ache of loneliness that had defined my days since Paul's passing now seemed like a distant echo, replaced by something I never thought I'd feel again. Hope. As Ethan stirred, his eyes slowly opened, and a soft smile spread across his face. "Morning," he said, his voice low and warm. "Morning," I replied, my own smile tugging at the corners of my lips. We stayed like that for a while, neither of us rushing to move or speak. It was as if we both knew that this moment was fragile, that stepping out of it would mean facing the reality of what lay ahead. Eventually, Ethan broke the silence. "How are you feeling?" I took a deep breath, considering his question. "Scared," I admitted softly. "But also hopeful." He nodded, his thumb brushing gently against my arm. "Me too," he said. It was a simple exchange, but it carried the weight of everything we were navigating. Later, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, we made our way to the kitchen. Ethan started the coffee, and I pulled out bread and eggs, our movements easy and familiar. It felt natural, like we'd done this 100 times before. But as we sat down to eat, the weight of what we needed to discuss hung between us. "What happens next?" I asked, breaking the silence. Ethan set his coffee mug down, his gaze steady. "I want this," he said simply. "I want us. But I know it's not going to be easy." I nodded, my chest tightening. "There's a lot to think about," I said. "There is," he agreed. "But I'm willing to take it one step at a time, if you are." His words were like a lifeline, grounding me in the uncertainty of it all. The days that followed were a strange mix of joy and hesitation. Ethan stayed for the rest of the weekend, helping me with small projects around the house and filling the space with his laughter and easy presence. But as Sunday evening approached, reality began to creep in. Ethan had to leave for work the next morning, and the house would once again feel too quiet, too empty. "I'll come back next weekend," he said as we stood by the door, his bag slung over his shoulder. "You don't have to," I said, though part of me desperately wanted him to. "I want to," he replied firmly. "And I'll call every night if that's okay." "It's more than okay," I said, my voice trembling. As he leaned in to kiss me goodbye, I felt the weight of the moment settle over me. It wasn't just a goodbye, it was a promise, a quiet commitment to whatever this was between us. When his car pulled out of the driveway, the house felt empty again, but this time it didn't feel so permanent. Ethan kept his promise. He called every night, his voice a steady presence in the quiet evenings. We talked about everything: work, memories of Paul, even mundane things like what we'd had for dinner. Over the next few weeks, he visited every chance he got, and each visit brought us closer. We worked on the house together, filling it with laughter and warmth, and I began to see it as more than just a relic of the past. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of what we were doing felt too heavy. But every time, Ethan was there, steady and unwavering. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I turned to him, my heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," I said softly. "For what?" he asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "For reminding me that life doesn't end with loss," I said, my voice trembling. "For making me feel alive again." He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. "You've done the same for me," he said simply. As the weeks turned into months, our relationship deepened, and I found myself letting go of the guilt and fear that had once held me back. The house, once a place of sorrow, had become a place of renewal, a space where I could imagine a future instead of clinging to the past. One evening, as we finished another project, Ethan turned to me, his expression serious. "This house feels different now," he said. "It does," I agreed, looking around the room we'd just finished painting. "That's because of you," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "You've brought it back to life." Tears filled my eyes and I smiled, my chest tight with emotion. "We did that together," I said. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. Our journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Because with Ethan by my side, I knew we could face anything. Together.